name's Elliot Wild, and here are my three audience members. Okay, so for the most part, everyone enjoys the Olympics every 4 years. But what if I told you that to host the 2024 Paris Summer Olympics that just happened, it cost under $10 billion, which is over 25% of their expected budget. What's crazy about those numbers is that this was actually very cheap when it comes to funding and for the Olympics, and that most countries in the past have had to spend way more. The purpose of this speech is to convince my audience that the Olympics might not be as good as everyone thinks it is, especially when it comes to financials and the infrastructure. And while there are clear positives such as gathering the world's best athletes to compete in your country and having the spotlight on your nation, there are clear negatives to it as well. And to show why nations nowadays are not willing to host the Olympics as in the past. We will dive into the financial ruin that many countries have faced after hosting the Olympics and explain how much money they've had to spend just to create the Olympics in their home nation. Another topic that will be discussed is all the resources, such as facilities and stadiums that get discarded and ignored after the Olympics take place. Finally, we will explore why the International Olympic Committee is struggling to find nations to host the Olympics, which further proves that there are many negatives to hosting the Games. While you may not feel that this is a big deal for you, the Olympics are coming to America in 2026, and I'm sure that billions of dollars will be spent on creating those Olympic Games as opposed to other areas where funding might be needed in our country. So, the first main point revolves around the financial ramifications around funding for the Olympics. If it happens to be hosted in your city, and data that shows cities who have hosted the Games and how it's left them in financial ruin. The most extreme example of this occurred in Montreal in 1976. They went over their original budget by around 720%. But how did this happen? Let's find out. According to an article detailing the financial risk around hosting the Olympics written by James McBride, Noah Bremen, and Melissa Mono, the predicted cost of 124 million was billions below the actual cost, largely due to construction delays and cost overruns for a new stadium, saddling the city's taxpayers with some $1.5 billion in debt that took 3 decades to pay off. The original budget was around 300 million, however, it ended up being 1.5 billion, which in today's economy would be around a staggering 6.1 billion dollars. When comparing the city's original budget heading into the construction of the games and what the actual price ended up being, we can see that they went over their budget by 720%. To put these shocking numbers into perspective, could you imagine house hunting or apartment hunting and going over your budget by 720%? This ended up being the first major example of a host city going into financial ruin because of the games that sent them back upon decades and decades, which cost many countries who wanted to host the Olympics food for thought, as they weren't sure if it was financially worth the risk. This would be far from the first time that this occurred as well. Another city that ended up financially struggling because of the Olympics was the 2014 Winter Olympic Games in Sochi, Russia. These games were heavily scrutinized and already had many controversies due to the country hosting it and many allegations of doping being used in the events. But they also lost tons of money building and hosting the Olympics as well. It ended up costing over $55 billion, which is by far the most expensive games in the Olympics history. A huge portion of the funding money went to security, which was because of the many terrorist threats and dangers that were happening at the time. As we can see, just because hosting the Olympics is a very prestigious thing to happen in your city, it doesn't mean that you will benefit from it in the nation, and there are many examples as cities putting themselves in serious financial trouble because of the games. However, that's not all, as infrastructure plays a huge role as to why the Olympics might not be as beneficial as one might expect. So, what happens to all the facilities and stadiums that these host cities build after the Olympics are over? Believe it or not, there have been numerous cases where host cities will need to build new facilities and stadiums for the Olympics and then just completely mishandle or abandon them after the games are over. This is extremely sad to hear, because why would you waste all that money and time into building new arenas just to ignore them long term after the Olympics are long gone? According to Simon Whistler, who hosted a YouTube video on the Side Projects channel detailing the abandonment of numerous facilities that were forgotten about after the Olympics, talks about Rio 2016, where the biggest facility attraction at the Olympics that year was the renovation of the Maracana Stadium, which hosted the opening and closing ceremonies. The city of Rio did an awful job of maintaining the stadium after the Olympics concluded in 2016, which experienced vandalism, power outages, the pitch on the field began to turn brown, and shortly after all this occurred, the city decided to shut down the stadium for good, as it was completely abandoned by its owners. Fortunately, nowadays, it has been remodeled, and the Brazilian soccer teams of Flamengo and Fluminense now reside there. Another city that struggled in maintaining facilities shortly after the conclusion of the Olympics occurred in 1996 was in Pyeongchang. This was when they hosted the 2018 Winter Olympics. Due to Pyeongchang being a relatively low population city and them having no big sports teams, they simply got rid of the Pyeongchang Olympic Stadium right after the closing ceremony of the Games. The construction of the stadium ended up being around $109 million, and with the sole purpose of the stadium was just for the Olympics, ended up being a huge waste of money, and makes you wonder why they spent that much just for it to be wasted for the Olympics anyway. Now that we have a better understanding of how much money each host city wastes on building Olympic Games and how simply they just abandon or demolish numerous facilities after the conclusion of the Games, we will now dive into why most countries and cities do not want to host the Olympics anymore and why the International Olympic Committee is struggling to find a host altogether. So to why no one wants to host the Olympic Games anymore, to bring it back to the beginning, where I discussed the most recent 2024 Paris Summer Olympics budget, the reason why that was so cheap compared to most of the other host cities' constructions was simply because Paris already had most of the sporting arenas and hotels, and so they did not need to build that many new facilities. Even when they had most of the infrastructure already, it still cost them around $10 billion. This raises a question then. If you are hoping to host the Olympics one day, if you do not have the infrastructure like what Paris has, which most cities don't, then why host it in the beginning, and is it even worth it? As it turns out, the cities have answered that question because according to the Medium newsletter, hosting the Olympics is so expensive that no one really wants to do it anymore. As Kaylin Savage on Medium explains, Brisbane was the only city to submit a bid for 2032. This should be worrying for the Olympics, as cities in the past would line up and spend millions of dollars just to attempt to host the Olympics, and now no one wants to do it at all. In conclusion, there are many factors such as financial troubles, building the Olympic Games, and mismanaging or demolishing many sporting facilities after the conclusion of the Olympics, and the fact that no cities actually want to host the Olympics anymore heading into the 2030s, that maybe hosting the Olympics is not as beneficial as the Olympic campaign suggests. And I, for one, hope that they actually try to tackle these issues and not try to just promote it as this big positive thing. And I hope that they're not so I hope they make it to where it's not as wasteful and financially risky for the cities. Once again, I spoke about the negative effects of hosting the Olympics to shed light on how wasteful and how dangerous it can be for an economy to host it, and why cities nowadays are way more wary about hosting the game itself. Now, to go back to the question that I raised at the beginning, do you think that it is beneficial for cities and countries to host the Olympics as the Olympic tries to portray it? Thank you for listening to my speech. Goodbye, everyone.